Hi. So, here's another of my favourite what do you do whens. And it's a question that's not infrequently asked on training courses, which is what do you do when the client, the patient, the service user, whoever it is, coachee, asks for advice? Because people have realised really quite quickly when exploring and examining solution focus that this is not an approach that typically gives advice. We work really hard so that the client has the experience, I did that. And so we're inviting people to find their own best ways of moving forward, rather than giving people our ideas about what they should do or could be doing. And yet, of course, the idea that you're meeting with an expert who can give you advice is not an unusual one. So why wouldn't a client say to you, look, I guess you're an expert in this. Can you tell me what to do? I really would like some advice. And at times, that can be an answer, not frequently, but occasionally, that can be an answer to the best hopes question. So what are your best hopes from our talking together? Well, I'm hoping to go away from here with some ideas, some advice about what I can do in order to solve this. Now, as usual, there are a number of useful ways of responding to tell me what to do. And one way of responding to tell me what to do is, of course, agreeing. It really isn't a good idea to argue with people. Arguing with people is a high-risk intervention, whereas going along with what people want tends to build cooperation and partnership much more effectively. So we can begin to ask, we can say two things. One is, we can say to people, look, in order to come up with some good advice, some useful advice, some advice that actually is going to work for you, I'm going to have to ask you lots of questions. Are you up for that? And because you're agreeing to do what people want, of course, people say, yeah. So, of course, they're up for questions. And at that point, away we go in a solution-focused session. So what are your best hopes from our talking together? And if that were happening, how would you know? And tell me about the tiny little bits of that preferred future that are already in place. And how do you do that? And at the end of the session, we can now go back to advice. So given the work that we've been doing together today, given the talking that we've been doing together today, if you had to give yourself some good advice just based on this session, what do you think you'd be telling yourself to do at this point in the session? What's emerged for you as potentially a useful way forward? So on the basis of the session, the client constructs their own advice in that sense. Now again, there's some people who are more fixed perhaps on the idea of advice. Advice is really important for them. They've been thinking for the last 3 weeks before your meeting with them about getting some advice, and so they really, really want advice. And if people really, really, really want advice, again, I'd say, look, in order for me to give you some useful advice, some advice that's right for you, rather than any old advice that could work for anyone, again, it really is going to be important for me to find out what you want and how you'd want life to be. And people will normally go along with that. And at the end of that, if they still really want advice, one of the things that I've done with people is what I think of as the virtual group advice response. So I've said to people in the past, again, not often, but I've said to people in the past, look, with people who've wanted what you've wanted in terms of making changes. Okay? Look, I've known people who've done A, and that seemed to work pretty well for them. I've known people who've done B, and that seemed to work for them. And I've known people who've done C, and that seems to have been useful. Look, do you think any of those could be useful to you? Or do you think that your best way forward is going to be completely different from those people's ways of moving forward? And if people say, yeah, I would guess that approach A might work best, then we invite people to personalize. So if you were to be using approach A, in the way that was just right for you, how would you notice yourself using that idea? So the person is invited to own the advice and to take it on, to personalize it in that sense. Now, of course, sometimes there has been no mention of advice during the course of the session. And when we get to the end of the session, one of the things that I tend to say to people is there anything you had in mind to say today that I've not given you the opportunity to say? That's just before I move into an ending sequence. And at that point, and this actually did happen to me recently, someone said, look, do you have any advice for us in terms of how to move forward? Now, advice was rather sprung on me at that point. And the way that I responded was by saying, look, I think it's really, really important to get advice right. Rather than, me giving you any old advice, it's important for us to find some advice that will allow you to find the, as it were, Evan George way of moving forward, all right, using their name, rather than an approach that actually might work for someone else but might not work for you. Does that make sense? And these people said yes. Say, well, look, in that case, I've actually got something to ask you to do. Would that be okay? People say yes, because you're agreeing to do what they want. It's research, really. So between now and then, now and next time we meet, what I'd like to ask you to do, if I'm going to be able to come up with some useful advice in your situation, some advice that might be right for you, what I'd like to ask you to do is to watch out for those times when, and of course what we say and what I said, is little bits of the preferred future happening. And the job, your job, the research job, is for the two of you, or three of you, or four of you, or for you, if it's just one person, to be watching out very, very carefully for what you're doing at those times that works. And on the basis of that, my guess is that we can shape some useful advice, some advice that would be just right for you.